Think you know what power and privilege look like? Meet Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius of Rome, a woman so consumed by sexual appetite that she turned the Roman Empire into her personal hunting ground. But here's the part that will make your jaw drop. This wasn't some secret scandal whispered about in dark corners. Messalina's sexual exploits were so public, so brazen, and so absolutely insane that they're documented in official Roman historical records. Let's start with the most shocking fact. Messalina would leave the imperial palace at night, wearing a blonde wig to disguise herself, and head straight to Rome's most notorious brothel. Not to raid it, not to shut it down, but to work there. The Empress of Rome, one of the most powerful women on earth, was moonlighting as a prostitute in the establishment called the Lupinarium. But wait, it gets worse. She wasn't just visiting brothels for the thrill. Ancient Roman historian Pliny the Elder documented that Messalina entered into an official competition with Rome's most successful prostitute, a woman named Sylla. The challenge was simple and absolutely revolting. Who could have sex with more men in a single night? According to historical records, Messalina serviced 25 men in one session. 25. The Empress of Rome had turned her own body into a competition sport, and she won. Sylla, a professional prostitute who had spent her entire adult life in the trade, couldn't match the Empress's stamina. Think about that for a moment. A woman who had unlimited wealth, power, and access to anything she could possibly want, chose to spend her nights competing with sex workers. The brothel owners knew exactly who she was. Her guards waited outside while the Empress of Rome worked room after room, taking client after client. Some of these men were common laborers, soldiers, even slaves. They had no idea they were sleeping with the woman who ruled over them. And Messalina loved every degrading moment of it. But the brothel competitions were just her warm-up act. Inside the palace, Messalina was creating a sexual empire that would make modern scandals look like children's games. She kept detailed lists of Roman aristocrats and their wives, ranking them by attractiveness and sexual potential. These weren't fantasy lists, they were target acquisitions. The palace servants lived in constant terror. Everyone knew that when Messalina summoned you, refusal meant death. Male servants were regularly pulled from their duties to satisfy the Empress's insatiable appetite. Some of these men were married, some were barely adults. None of them had a choice. You either performed for the Empress or you disappeared. Roman Senator Gaius Silius later testified that palace guards would actually draw straws to determine who had to serve Messalina that day. Being chosen wasn't considered an honor. It was considered a punishment. The Empress's sexual demands were so extreme, so physically exhausting, that men would genuinely fear being called to her chambers. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. Emperor Claudius knew. Everyone at court knew. But Claudius was terrified of his own wife. He was older, physically disabled with a limp and speech impediment, and Messalina had made it crystal clear that any attempt to control her would result in his assassination. The most powerful man in Rome was a prisoner in his own palace, cuckolded daily by a wife who didn't even bother hiding her contempt for him. Messalina would host elaborate dinner parties where she'd openly fondle her current favorites, while Claudius sat at the head of the table, pretending not to notice. Senators would watch in horror as the Empress's hand disappeared under the table, pleasuring whoever had caught her attention that evening, all while discussing matters of state. But Messalina's appetite wasn't satisfied by quantity alone. She needed degradation, humiliation, and absolute power over her partners. What she did to Rome's aristocratic families would destroy the empire's social fabric in ways that would take generations to repair. If you thought Messalina's brothel adventures were the worst of it, you haven't heard anything yet. What this woman did to Rome's noble families was so systematically cruel, so psychologically devastating, that it makes medieval torture look merciful. Messalina didn't just want sex. She wanted to destroy people, to break them completely, and she had the power of the Roman Empire behind her to do it. Messalina created what can only be described as a forced harem, but with a twist that reveals the true depths of her cruelty. She would identify beautiful women from aristocratic families, women who were married to powerful senators, successful merchants or military commanders. Then she'd send imperial guards to collect them. These weren't invitations. They were arrests. Women would be torn from their homes, sometimes in front of their children, and brought to the palace. Their husbands would receive a simple message. Your wife has been summoned by the Empress. Report to the palace tonight. And here's where Messalina's sadism reached truly horrific levels. The husbands were forced to attend. They would be brought to a special chamber in the palace where they'd be seated in chairs, restrained if necessary, and forced to watch as Messalina orchestrated elaborate orgies involving their wives. But the Empress didn't participate in these sessions. She directed them like a theatrical production, choosing partners for the captive women, demanding specific acts, and mocking the husbands as they watched their marriages being destroyed. Historical accounts from Tacitus describe one particularly devastating evening where Senator Cornelius Lupus was forced to watch as his wife of 15 years was passed between 6 different men over the course of 4 hours. Messalina sat on a throne-like chair, eating grapes and laughing, occasionally pausing to ask Lupus how he was enjoying the entertainment. When his wife finally broke down sobbing, Messalina ordered guards to hold Lupus's eyes open, forcing him to watch every moment of his wife's humiliation. But wait, it gets worse. After these forced orgies, Messalina would give the husbands a choice. They could either publicly thank the Empress for the honor she'd bestowed upon their wives, or they could refuse and face treason charges. Refusal meant execution, property confiscation, and their entire family would be destroyed. Most men chose survival over dignity. The psychological warfare was calculated and brutal. Messalina knew that forcing these men to publicly express gratitude for their own humiliation would break them more completely than any physical torture. She was destroying their masculinity, their honor, and their ability to function in Roman society, all while making them complicit in their own degradation. Some families chose suicide over submission. Historical records document at least 14 noble families who killed themselves rather than face Messalina's summons. Fathers would poison their daughters, husbands would kill their wives and then themselves, entire households would drink hemlock together. The Empress's sexual demands had become so terrifying that death seemed preferable. Senator Valerius Asiaticus and his wife chose to die together in their garden, surrounded by their family, rather than allow Messalina to defile them. Their suicide note, preserved in historical records, simply stated, "We choose honor over survival." Messalina had their property confiscated anyway, and gave their villa to one of her current lovers. But the forced harem wasn't just about sexual gratification. It was about absolute power and the complete destruction of Rome's social order. Messalina was demonstrating that no family was safe, no marriage was sacred, and no amount of wealth or status could protect you from her desires. She was teaching the aristocracy that they existed solely for her amusement. The palace became a place of constant terror. Women lived in fear that they'd be the next one summoned. Husbands desperately tried to make their wives less attractive, hoping to avoid Messalina's attention. Some families sent their daughters to live in remote provinces, effectively exiling them to protect them from the Empress. Young brides would weep on their wedding nights, not from joy, but from fear that their marriage would attract Messalina's attention. Beauty had become a curse in Rome. Being desirable meant being a target. The Empress had turned the entire city into her personal hunting ground, and every attractive woman was potential prey. Messalina kept detailed records of her conquests, maintained by palace scribes who documented every forced encounter. These weren't just lists of names. They included descriptions of what was done, how the victims reacted, whether their husbands cried or remained stoic. The Empress was cataloging human suffering like it was a collection of rare wines. The truly chilling part is that this systematic sexual terrorism continued for years. Claudius either couldn't or wouldn't stop it. Some historians suggest he was genuinely terrified of his wife. Others believe he was too focused on military campaigns and governance to deal with domestic matters. Either way, Messalina had free rein to terrorize Rome's elite, and she used that freedom to create a nightmare that would haunt families for generations. What happened to the women who were forced to participate in Messalina's orgies was even more tragic. Many never recovered psychologically. Some retreated into complete silence, becoming shells of their former selves. Others developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, unable to be touched by their own husbands, forever traumatized by what had been done to them. But Messalina's reign of sexual terror was building towards something even more shocking. Her appetite for degradation and power was about to reach levels that would finally push Rome past its breaking point. If you thought Messalina had reached the limits of what one human being could do with absolute power, you were wrong. What this woman did next wasn't just shocking, it was political suicide wrapped in sexual arrogance. Messalina was about to commit an act so brazen, so publicly humiliating to the emperor, that it would finally unite Rome's elite against her. And the twisted part is that she knew exactly what she was doing. Gaius Silius was a Roman consul, one of the most handsome men in Rome, and already married to a respectable woman. None of that mattered to Messalina. She wanted him, and what Messalina wanted, Messalina took. She had Silius's wife quietly removed from the picture, historians suggest poison, and installed Silius as her primary lover. But being the Empress's favorite wasn't enough for Messalina anymore. She needed something bigger, something that would shock even the jaded Roman aristocracy. In the year 48 AD, while Emperor Claudius was away on business in Ostia, Messalina did the unthinkable. She married Gaius Silius, not in secret, not in some hidden ceremony, but in a full public wedding with all the traditional Roman rituals. She was still legally married to Claudius. She was still the Empress of Rome, and she was publicly marrying another man in front of hundreds of witnesses. The wedding was held at the imperial palace. Messalina wore the traditional bridal veil and flame-colored dress. Priests performed the sacred rites. Guests brought wedding gifts. The whole ceremony was conducted as if Claudius simply didn't exist, as if the emperor's marriage to Messalina had been erased by her sheer force of will. This wasn't adultery. This was open rebellion disguised as a wedding celebration. But here's where it gets truly insane. Messalina had convinced herself that this was legal. She'd surrounded herself with advisors who told her what she wanted to hear. That as Empress, she had the power to dissolve her own marriage. That Silius would make a better emperor than Claudius. That Rome would accept this transition of power. She was living in a fantasy world where her sexual desires had become confused with political reality. The wedding feast was obscene, even by Messalina's standards. Guests watched in horror as the new bride climbed onto tables and performed acts that would make a brothel worker blush. She had servants bring out the imperial wine reserves, the ones reserved for state ceremonies, and proceeded to drink herself into a stupor while grinding on Silius in front of senators, priests, and foreign dignitaries. At one point during the feast, Messalina stood on a table and announced that she and Silius would be co-rulers of Rome. She declared that Claudius was too weak, too old, too pathetic to rule effectively. The room fell silent. Everyone present knew they were witnessing either a revolution or a suicide, and nobody was sure which. Roman historian Tacitus documented that some guests tried to leave, terrified of being associated with what was clearly treason. But Messalina had guards posted at every exit. Nobody was leaving until she gave permission. She wanted witnesses. She wanted everyone to know that she'd officially replaced Claudius, that her new marriage was legitimate, that Rome now belonged to her and Silius. What Messalina didn't realize was that several of the guests at her wedding feast were already planning to inform Claudius. Palace freedmen, men who'd watched Messalina's reign of terror for years, saw their opportunity. They knew that this public marriage was finally the proof they needed to convince Claudius to act against his wife. The morning after the wedding, while Messalina and Silius were still sleeping off their drunken celebration, riders were already racing to Ostia to inform the emperor. They carried witness testimony from dozens of senators, priests, and aristocrats who'd attended the wedding. This wasn't gossip or rumor. This was documented treason with hundreds of witnesses. But wait, it gets worse. When the messengers reached Claudius and told him what had happened, the emperor didn't believe them at first. He thought it was a joke, some kind of elaborate prank. His wife had married another man in the imperial palace while he was away. It was too absurd to be real. The messengers had to bring written testimony from multiple sources before Claudius finally accepted that his wife had committed the most public act of betrayal in Roman history. The freedmen who'd brought the news knew they had one chance to convince Claudius to act. They painted a terrifying picture. Messalina and Silius were planning a coup. They would murder Claudius when he returned to Rome. They would install Silius as emperor with Messalina as his empress. The wedding wasn't just adultery, it was the first step in overthrowing the emperor. Whether this coup plot was real or fabricated by the freedmen desperate to destroy Messalina, we'll never know. But it worked. Claudius, finally pushed past his breaking point, gave the order that would end Messalina's reign of sexual terror. She was to be arrested and executed for treason. The empress who'd terrorized Rome for years was about to discover that even unlimited power has limits. Back in Rome, Messalina woke up to find guards surrounding the palace. But these weren't her usual guards. These were Praetorian soldiers loyal to Claudius, and they had orders to take her into custody. For the first time in years, Messalina heard the word no. She couldn't seduce these men. She couldn't threaten them. She couldn't buy them. They were there to arrest the Empress of Rome, and nothing was going to stop them. Messalina's world collapsed in hours. The same aristocrats who'd been forced to participate in her orgies, who'd watched their wives being defiled, who'd lived in terror of her summons, they all turned on her instantly. Nobody would shelter her. Nobody would help her. The woman who'd wielded absolute sexual power over Rome suddenly found herself completely alone, hunted in her own city. What happened next would be brutal, public, and exactly what Messalina had spent her entire life inflicting on others. The predator was about to become prey, and Rome was going to enjoy every moment of her downfall. Messalina ran. The Empress of Rome, the woman who'd made senators grovel and families destroy themselves, was running through the imperial gardens like a common criminal. The Praetorian Guard was closing in, and for the first time in her life, Messalina understood what real fear felt like. Every person she'd terrorized, every family she'd destroyed, every woman she'd forced into her orgies, they'd all felt this same desperate panic. Now it was her turn. She'd tried everything. When the guards first arrived, she'd attempted to seduce them, offering sexual favors, promising promotions, using every trick that had worked for years. The soldiers just stared at her with cold contempt. One of them, a veteran whose daughter had committed suicide after being summoned by Messalina, actually spat at her feet. The Empress's sexual power meant nothing anymore. She was just another criminal waiting to be executed. Messalina fled the palace wearing nothing but a thin sleeping gown, her carefully maintained appearance forgotten in her panic. She ran barefoot through the gardens where she'd hosted countless orgies, past the fountains where she'd humiliated senators' wives, through the same pathways where she'd paraded her conquests. The gardens that had been her playground were now her hunting ground, and she was the prey. Historical accounts describe her desperately trying to reach her mother's house, believing family loyalty might save her. But even Messalina's own mother refused to shelter her. When Messalina pounded on the door, screaming to be let in, her mother shouted back that she had no daughter. The woman who'd given birth to Messalina wanted no association with the monster her daughter had become. The door remained locked, while Messalina sobbed outside. She tried reaching out to former lovers, the men she'd elevated to positions of power in exchange for sexual services. None of them responded to her desperate pleas. The senators she'd forced to thank her for raping their wives watched from their windows as she ran through the streets, and they smiled. Gaius Silius, the man she'd just married in that elaborate public ceremony, had already been arrested and executed. His head was displayed on a spike as a warning. Messalina's new husband hadn't even lasted 24 hours. As the sun set, Messalina found herself in the gardens of Lucullus, a place she'd personally claimed from an aristocratic family she'd destroyed. She'd turned these beautiful gardens into her private sex club, hosting orgies that sometimes lasted for days. Now she was hiding in the bushes, scratched and bleeding from running through thorns, listening to the guards getting closer. But wait, it gets worse. In her desperation, Messalina tried one final gambit. She sent a message to Claudius, carried by a slave who was too terrified to refuse. The message begged for mercy, promised to reform, swore she'd be faithful. She even offered to voluntarily become a Vestal virgin, taking a vow of celibacy for the rest of her life. The irony was almost funny. The most sexually voracious woman in Rome was offering to become celibate if it would save her life. Claudius never responded. Whether he even read the message is unknown. His advisors, the same freedmen who'd finally convinced him to act against Messalina, made sure the emperor remained firm. They knew that any moment of weakness, any hint of mercy, and Messalina would find a way to manipulate her way back into power. She had to die, and she had to die quickly. The guards found her hiding near a small temple in the gardens. Tacitus records that when they discovered her, Messalina tried one last desperate act of seduction. She tore open her gown, exposed herself, and offered to pleasure all of them if they'd let her escape. The guards' response was silence. They'd been given explicit orders. Messalina was to be executed immediately, no trial, no delay, no possibility of her talking her way out of punishment. Tribune Evidus, the officer in charge of the execution, stood before the cowering Empress. This was the same man who'd been forced to watch Messalina defile his wife 2 years earlier. His wife had never recovered from the trauma and had spent the last year in a near catatonic state. Evidus had dreamed of this moment, of seeing Messalina powerless and terrified. Now it was real, and he was going to save her every second. Messalina begged. She wept. She crawled on her knees. She offered everything she had: money, property, sexual favors, information about other conspiracies. Nothing worked. The woman who'd spent years watching others beg for mercy was now experiencing what she'd inflicted on so many. And just like she'd shown no mercy to her victims, Rome would show no mercy to her. Evidus gave her a choice, the same choice Romans gave to condemned aristocrats. She could die with dignity by her own hand, or the guards would do it for her. Messalina's hands shook as she was given a dagger. She held it to her throat, trying to find the courage to push it in, but she couldn't do it. Years of inflicting pain on others hadn't prepared her for inflicting it on herself. After several minutes of watching her fail to commit suicide, Evidus lost patience. He stepped forward and drove his sword through Messalina's chest. She fell in the same gardens where she'd celebrated her illegal wedding just hours before. The Empress of Rome died in the dirt, wearing a torn sleeping gown, covered in her own blood and the scratches from rose thorns. Her body was left where it fell. No funeral, no ceremony, no honors. Claudius gave orders that Messalina's name was to be erased from all public monuments. Her images were destroyed, her accomplishments forgotten. Rome wanted to pretend she'd never existed. The gardens where she died were immediately opened to the public, as if to cleanse them of her presence. But the story doesn't end with her death. What came after, what was discovered in the investigation following her execution, would reveal horrors that made even her public crimes look tame. After Messalina's execution, Claudius ordered a complete investigation of her activities. What they found in her private chambers made even hardened Roman soldiers sick. The Empress hadn't just been sexually voracious. She'd been documenting everything, collecting evidence of her own depravity like trophies, and the scale of her crimes went far beyond what anyone had imagined. Messalina's personal quarters contained rooms that even palace servants hadn't been allowed to enter. When investigators finally broke through the locked doors, they discovered what can only be described as a museum of sexual horror. The walls were covered with erotic frescoes, but these weren't artistic representations. They were commissioned paintings depicting specific orgies, with the faces of actual Roman citizens clearly identifiable. Messalina had been creating a gallery of humiliation. But the paintings were just decoration. The real evidence was in the scrolls, hundreds of them, carefully organized and catalogued by palace scribes who'd been sworn to secrecy. These documents contained detailed accounts of every sexual encounter Messalina had orchestrated over the past 6 years. names, dates, descriptions of what was done, notes about how victims reacted. It was a comprehensive record of systematic sexual terrorism. One set of scrolls documented the forced harem in explicit detail. Each woman who'd been summoned was listed with her full name, her husband's name, and detailed notes about her experience. Some entries included sketches. Others had samples of hair or fabric attached, like Messalina was collecting specimens. The level of organization was terrifying. This wasn't impulsive lust. It was calculated, methodical abuse documented like a military campaign. Investigators found a separate set of records detailing financial transactions. Messalina had been extorting families for years. After forcing their wives and daughters into her orgies, she'd demand payment to keep the details private. Families had paid enormous sums, bankrupting themselves to protect their reputations, only to discover that Messalina kept detailed records anyway. She'd been blackmailing victims, while simultaneously documenting the crimes she was blackmailing them about. But wait, it gets worse. Hidden in a locked chest beneath her bed, investigators found what appeared to be a collection of jewelry and personal items. When they examined these objects more closely, they realized they were trophies taken from victims. Wedding rings, forcibly removed from women during orgies. A lock of hair cut from a senator's wife. A torn piece of clothing from a girl who'd committed suicide after being summoned. Messalina had been collecting souvenirs of human suffering. The most disturbing discovery was a series of letters written by Messalina herself, apparently never sent. These letters detailed her thoughts and feelings about her victims. She wrote about the pleasure she felt watching families destroy themselves, about her enjoyment of breaking marriages, about her contempt for the people she'd forced to thank her for their own humiliation. The letters revealed a level of sadism that went beyond mere sexual appetite. Messalina had genuinely enjoyed inflicting psychological torture. One letter, addressed to no one, described in detail how she'd orchestrated the suicide of Senator Valerius Asiaticus and his family. She deliberately made her demands increasingly extreme, knowing they would choose death over compliance. She wrote about watching their villa from a distance on the day they killed themselves, about the satisfaction she felt knowing she'd driven an entire family to mass suicide. The letter ended with a single sentence. They chose weakness. I choose power. The investigation also uncovered evidence of Messalina's involvement in political assassinations. Several senators who'd disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances over the past years were listed in her private documents as obstacles removed. She'd been using her sexual leverage to gather blackmail material, then using that material to force people into committing murder on her behalf. The sexual depravity had been just one tool in a larger campaign of terror. Palace servants, finally free to speak without fear of execution, came forward with their own testimonies. They described rooms in the palace that were specifically designed for torture. One chamber had restraints built into the walls and furniture designed to hold victims in specific positions. Another had viewing areas where Messalina could watch from behind screens while orchestrating scenes of degradation. She'd turned the imperial palace into a facility for systematic abuse. The servants revealed that Messalina had been drugging people. Wine served at her dinners often contained substances that lowered inhibitions or caused confusion. Some victims of her orgies hadn't been fully aware of what was happening to them. They'd been chemically subdued and then violated while barely conscious. The level of premeditation was chilling. Young men who'd served as Messalina's lovers came forward with their own stories. Many had been teenagers when first summoned by the Empress, some as young as 15. They described being groomed over time, starting with small favors and gifts, gradually escalating to sexual demands. Those who tried to refuse found their families threatened with financial ruin or worse. Messalina had been operating a system of sexual coercion that ensnared entire families. The most tragic testimonies came from the women who'd survived her forced harem. Many were still too traumatized to speak publicly, but those who did come forward painted a picture of systematic rape and psychological destruction. Some women described being held in the palace for days or weeks, forced to participate in repeated orgies, with guards ensuring they couldn't escape or kill themselves. Messalina had been running what amounted to a sexual torture chamber in the heart of Rome. Investigators discovered that at least 34 people had committed suicide directly because of Messalina's actions. Another 12 had been murdered on her orders. Hundreds of families had been financially destroyed by her extortion. The full scope of her crimes was so extensive that Claudius ordered the investigation sealed. He feared that making everything public would destabilize the entire empire. But there was one more discovery waiting. One final revelation that would make everything else seem almost mundane. What they found in the sealed chamber beneath Messalina's quarters would explain the depths of her depravity and reveal a secret she'd been hiding from everyone, even her closest confidants. The sealed chamber was discovered almost by accident. A servant noticed that Messalina's bedroom had strange proportions, that one wall seemed shorter than the others. When investigators broke through the false wall, they found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. What waited at the bottom would haunt everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. The underground chamber was small, barely large enough for 3 people to stand. It was cold, damp, and smelled of decay despite the sealed entrance. The walls were stone, rough, and unmarked. In the center of the room stood a single stone table, and on that table sat dozens of small clay jars, each one carefully sealed and labeled with dates written in Messalina's own handwriting. The investigators opened the first jar and immediately understood what they'd found. Inside, preserved in wine mixed with honey, was a tiny deformed fetus. The second jar contained another. The third, fourth, fifth, all the same. Messalina had been collecting the remains of pregnancies she'd terminated, storing them like someone might collect rare coins or precious gems. The chamber was a mausoleum for the unborn. The dates on the jars spanned 6 years, matching almost exactly with the duration of Messalina's marriage to Claudius. There were 47 jars in total, 47 pregnancies that Messalina had terminated, documented, and preserved. The implications were staggering. With the amount of indiscriminate sex Messalina had been having, pregnancy was inevitable. What everyone suddenly realized was that she'd been dealing with the consequences in secret for years. But wait, it gets worse. Medical examination of the preserved remains revealed that many of these fetuses showed severe deformities. Some had multiple developmental abnormalities, suggesting genetic problems or damage from the substances Messalina had been using to terminate pregnancies. Roman physicians who examined the remains suggested that some of these deformities might have been caused by diseases Messalina had contracted from her numerous sexual partners. Palace physicians came forward with testimony they'd been too terrified to give while Messalina lived. The Empress had been suffering from multiple venereal diseases for years. She'd infected dozens of her partners, who'd then spread those diseases to their wives, creating cascading chains of infection throughout Rome's aristocracy. Some of the women who'd been forced into her orgies had contracted diseases that left them sterile. Messalina hadn't just destroyed marriages psychologically, she'd destroyed them biologically. The preserved fetuses also revealed another disturbing truth. Several appeared to be from advanced pregnancies, possibly 5 or 6 months along. These weren't early terminations. These were late-term procedures that would have been extraordinarily dangerous and painful. Messalina had been carrying pregnancies until they became physically obvious, then terminating them in secret. The level of physical trauma she'd inflicted on her own body was almost incomprehensible. Servants revealed that Messalina would disappear for days at a time, claiming illness, while she recovered from these procedures. The palace's private physician, a Greek doctor named Thessalus, admitted under questioning that he'd been performing these terminations under threat of death. He'd begged Messalina to stop, warning her that the repeated procedures were destroying her internally, but she'd insisted on continuing her sexual activities regardless of the consequences. Thessalus's testimony revealed something even more horrifying. Several of the later pregnancies had been far enough along that the fetuses were viable. In at least 3 cases, the babies had been born alive during the termination procedures. Messalina had ordered Thessalus to kill them immediately. The physician described holding newborn infants, fully formed and breathing, while Messalina commanded him to suffocate them so she could preserve them for her collection. The underground chamber also contained records explaining why Messalina had kept this macabre collection. She'd been tracking her own fertility, trying to determine which of her sexual partners was most likely to father children. The jars were labeled not just with dates but with initials, presumably indicating who she believed had fathered each pregnancy. It was a breeding experiment conducted on herself, with the failed results preserved like laboratory specimens. Medical experts examining Messalina's body after her death found extensive internal damage. Her uterus was scarred and infected. Her reproductive organs showed signs of repeated trauma. She'd been literally destroying herself from the inside while maintaining an external appearance of health and beauty. The autopsy revealed that, even if she'd survived her execution, Messalina probably wouldn't have lived much longer. The infections spreading through her abdomen would have killed her within months. The physicians also found evidence of the diseases she'd been carrying. Messalina had been suffering from at least 3 different sexually transmitted infections simultaneously. The pain from these conditions must have been constant and severe, yet she'd continued her sexual activities anyway. Whether she was driven by genuine compulsion or simply didn't care about the physical consequences, nobody could say. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a final jar, larger than the others, sitting separate from the rest. This jar was labeled with a date just 2 weeks before Messalina's execution. Inside was a fetus that appeared to be from a pregnancy of about 3 months. The timing coincided with her marriage to Gaius Silius. Messalina had been pregnant when she'd staged that public wedding, pregnant when she'd attempted her coup, and she'd terminated that pregnancy just days before her death. Claudius ordered the chamber sealed permanently. The jars were destroyed, the room was filled with concrete, and everyone involved in the discovery was sworn to secrecy. The official records mention only that Messalina died a traitor's death. The details of what was found beneath her chambers were suppressed for generations. But the truth leaked out eventually, as truth always does, preserved in the private writings of senators and historians who'd witnessed the aftermath. The Roman Senate passed a resolution declaring that Messalina's name was to be erased from all official records. Her children from Claudius were allowed to live but forbidden from ever mentioning their mother. Her property was confiscated, her estates destroyed. Rome wanted to forget that she'd ever existed. But the families she'd destroyed couldn't forget. The women she'd traumatized couldn't forget. The servants who'd been forced to facilitate her depravity couldn't forget. In the end, Messalina's legacy was exactly what she'd created: a trail of broken bodies, destroyed families, and psychological trauma that would echo through Roman society for decades. The woman who'd wielded sexual power as a weapon had died powerless, hunted through gardens where she'd once reigned supreme. Her body had been destroyed by her own appetites, rotting from the inside while she'd maintained her facade of imperial beauty. The underground chamber of preserved fetuses revealed the final truth about Messalina. She hadn't been a woman driven by uncontrollable lust. She'd been a sadist who used sex as a tool of terror, who enjoyed destruction more than pleasure, who documented suffering like an accountant tracking expenses. Her sexuality wasn't passion, it was pathology. The most powerful woman in Rome had ended up dying alone in the dirt, killed by a man whose life she'd destroyed, while an empire celebrated her death. Her carefully curated collection of horrors was destroyed and forgotten. Her name was erased from monuments, and the secret chamber where she'd preserved the evidence of her own self-destruction was sealed forever, buried beneath tons of concrete like the toxic waste it represented. Messalina's story stands as a reminder that absolute power doesn't just corrupt. It reveals. Given unlimited authority and freedom from consequences, this woman had created an empire of sexual terror, traumatized hundreds of people, and ultimately destroyed herself from the inside out. She'd lived as a predator and died as prey, experiencing in her final hours every emotion she'd inflicted on others: terror, helplessness, and the desperate realization that no amount of pleading would bring mercy. The Empress who competed with prostitutes, who forced senators to watch their wives being violated, who collected the remains of unwanted pregnancies like trophies, had her own legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. Rome would remember Messalina not as a powerful woman, but as a monster, A warning about what happens when depravity meets absolute power, and nobody has the courage to say no until it's far too late.